In the bustling hallway of a high school, the sound of laughter and lockers slamming echoed, until a sharp, commanding voice sliced through the air. "Stop right there." The laughter ceased. Students turned their heads, curious yet cautious. A young girl, confident in her stride, froze as a police officer pointed at her from across the corridor. "You think you can just walk around here dressed like that? You think this is appropriate for school?" His voice carried an edge that made even the bystanders uneasy. The girl stood her ground, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer stepped closer, towering over her. "Don't talk back to me, young lady. You're setting a bad example. And I've had enough of this attitude." The crowd began to gather. Whispers spread quickly. "What's going on? Why is he targeting her?" She glanced around, her confidence beginning to waver. "I'm not setting any example," she said, her voice softer now but no less firm. "I'm just being me." The officer smirked, pulling out a pair of scissors from his belt. "Not anymore. Let's fix this attitude right here, right now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "He can't be serious." But he was. He grabbed her arm roughly and pushed her toward a chair that was conveniently placed outside the principal's office. "Sit down." "What are you doing?" she demanded, struggling to free herself. "You can't touch me like this." The officer didn't listen. He snapped his fingers at the school principal, who stood nearby, hesitant and silent. "Back me up here. You've been complaining about her disruption all week." The principal looked away, shame flickering in his eyes, but he didn't object. The girl's voice cracked, her panic and anger spilling out. "This is wrong. I haven't done anything to deserve this." The officer grabbed a fistful of her hair. The metallic snip of scissors filled the air as strands of her identity, her pride, fell to the floor. Her classmates stood frozen, horrified yet silent, their phones now pointed in her direction, capturing every cruel second. "Now everyone will see what happens when you don't follow the rules," the officer declared, his voice cold and triumphant. Tears burned her cheeks, not from pain, but from the humiliation coursing through her veins. She scanned the crowd, searching for a face, for anyone who might help. Instead, she found only shock, fear, and a few muffled sobs. One voice finally broke the silence. "This isn't right." It was faint, almost lost in the tension. But no one dared to step forward. The officer threw the scissors onto the table and stepped back, satisfied. "There. Maybe now you'll think twice before you disrespect authority." The girl sat motionless, her shaved head exposed, her dignity scattered like the hair at her feet. But just as the officer began to walk away, the heavy sound of rushed footsteps approached. The room's energy shifted instantly, the tension becoming almost suffocating. "What is going on here?" a voice thundered, low and commanding, yet vibrating with fury. The officer turned, but his smirk faltered when he saw the man approaching. The crowd parted instinctively, making way for the figure who exuded power and authority. The girl's tear-filled eyes widened in recognition. Relief flooded her expression, though it was tinged with apprehension. The man stopped in his tracks, his eyes locking onto the officer and then drifting to the girl. His gaze darkened when he saw the scissors and the remnants of her hair on the floor. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, electric silence. And then, with a voice that could shake mountains, he spoke. "You," he said, pointing a finger at the officer, his tone icier than a winter storm. "Explain yourself. Right. Now." The officer stammered, trying to regain his footing. "She was being disruptive. I was enforcing discipline." "Discipline," the man interrupted, stepping closer, his voice rising. "Discipline is one thing. Humiliation is another. You have no authority to do what you just did. None." The officer swallowed hard, but he wasn't ready to back down. She needed to be taught a lesson. "It's about respect," The man's voice cut through the room like a blade. Respect? You think this is how you teach respect? By stripping a child of her dignity in front of her peers? The girl's classmates began to murmur. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of injustice finally being named. The officer tried to regain control. I was doing my job. The man's fury was contained, but barely. Your job, he said, leaning in, is to protect and serve. Not to destroy and humiliate. And let me tell you, this isn't over. The girl looked up at the man, her fear giving way to a glimmer of hope. The officer, however, paled under the weight of the man's words. The crowd sensed that the balance of power had shifted, but how far? How much would this man go to ensure justice was served? The tension hung heavy in the air, begging the question, what happens next when someone like him refuses to let this injustice stand? Stay with us, because this is only the beginning of a story that will leave you questioning everything about power, prejudice, and what it takes to fight for what's right. Before we dive into today's story, we at Plow of Twist want to take a moment to share something important. This channel stands firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or prejudice. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of stories to bring awareness to important issues. To all our Black viewers and allies, we see you, we support you, and we stand with you. Now, get ready for an emotional and powerful narrative filled with twists and lessons that will leave you thinking long after it's over. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories, and let's get into it. Enjoy the story. The day began like any other in the quiet suburb of Brighton Heights. Nestled on the outskirts of Chicago, the neighborhood was a patchwork of small brick houses, manicured lawns, and a diverse community trying to make ends meet. The local high school, Brighton Central, stood as a beacon in the heart of the neighborhood, a place where dreams were nurtured, but also where tension sometimes brewed just beneath the surface. Inside the school, a whirlwind of activity unfolded. Students streamed through the hallways, a mix of laughter, chatter, and the occasional clanging locker creating a chaotic yet familiar symphony. Among them was Naomi Carter, a 16-year-old junior with a magnetic presence that turned heads wherever she went. Naomi was a brilliant student, sharp, ambitious, and fiercely independent. Her deep brown eyes carried an intensity that spoke of someone wise beyond her years, and her hair, braided neatly, was not just a style but a celebration of her heritage. Naomi was the kind of person who made others take notice, not because she demanded attention but because she radiated authenticity. She loved science, often staying after school to work on experiments in the lab, and her dream of becoming a marine biologist was something she talked about often. But her life wasn't without challenges. As one of the few Black students at Brighton Central, Naomi was no stranger to the microaggressions and prejudices that sometimes simmered in the background of her daily life. Her father, Marcus Carter, was her anchor. A seasoned civil rights attorney, Marcus was the epitome of resilience and intellect. Standing tall and always impeccably dressed, he had a calm yet commanding demeanor that often left an impression on anyone who met him. He'd built his career fighting for justice in courtrooms across the state, and his passion for equality was something he instilled in Naomi from a young age. Their bond was unshakable. Marcus often reminded Naomi of her worth, encouraging her to embrace her identity and never back down in the face of adversity. They shared late-night talks at the dinner table, where Marcus would recount stories of cases he'd fought, weaving life lessons into every anecdote. Naomi, in turn, would update him on her school projects or discuss the latest book she was reading. It was a relationship built on mutual respect and unwavering love. But even with her father's guidance, Naomi couldn't escape the weight of the world outside their home. At school, she often felt the sting of being different. Teachers who underestimated her capabilities. Classmates who made subtle, cutting remarks about her hair or the way she spoke. And then there were people like Officer Daniel Grayson, the school's assigned resource officer. Grayson had been stationed at Brighton Central for over 3 years. A former beat cop, he carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on intimidation. Grayson wasn't outwardly cruel, but his bias was evident to anyone paying attention. He reserved his sternest lectures and harshest warnings for students like Naomi, often targeting them under the guise of discipline. His presence cast a long shadow in the school, and Naomi had felt its weight more than once. The tension between Naomi and Grayson had been brewing for months. He seemed to single her out during routine patrols in the hallways, questioning her for standing idly by her locker or for speaking too loudly in the cafeteria. Naomi had always managed to keep her composure, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to want. But it wasn't easy. The school itself was a microcosm of the broader society, its walls painted with inspirational quotes about equality and ambition, while the reality inside told a more complicated story. Teachers like Mrs. Addison, the principal, often turned a blind eye to the inequities that played out daily. Addison wasn't a bad person, but she was a product of her environment, more concerned with avoiding conflict than addressing the root of the issues. Naomi's friend group was small but tight-knit. Jasmine, her best friend since elementary school, was her confidant and biggest cheerleader. Jasmine was a bundle of energy, always ready with a joke or a word of encouragement. Then there was Eli, a quiet but loyal classmate who shared Naomi's love for science and often partnered with her on projects. They were her safe haven in a world that sometimes felt hostile. That day, Naomi had woken up feeling a little off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a heaviness in her chest as she packed her bag and headed out the door. The morning passed uneventfully, with the usual routine of classes and chatter. It wasn't until lunchtime that the storm began to brew. Naomi had just stepped into the cafeteria when Grayson appeared, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto her. He was talking to Principal Addison, and though Naomi couldn't hear their conversation, the pointed glances in her direction made her stomach tighten. Moments later, Addison's voice crackled over the intercom, calling Naomi to the office. As she walked down the hallway, the murmur of speculation followed her. By the time she arrived, Grayson was waiting with his arms crossed. Addison sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. "Naomi," Addison began, "we've been receiving complaints about your behavior. Officer Grayson believes you've been a disruptive influence." Naomi blinked, stunned. "Disruptive? How?" Grayson stepped forward, his voice cold. "Your appearance, for one. We've had parents complain about how unprofessional it looks for a school environment. You're setting a bad example." Naomi's jaw tightened. "My appearance has nothing to do with my education. I've done nothing wrong." Addison sighed, avoiding her gaze. "We just want to address the concerns, Naomi. It's important for all students to adhere to standards." "Standards?" Naomi's voice rose, incredulous. "What standards? I follow the dress code. I've never broken a rule." Grayson's smirk deepened. "That attitude right there, that's the problem." The room felt stifling, the air thick with unspoken tension. Naomi stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but this moment was the beginning of a nightmare she couldn't have imagined. A nightmare that would shatter the fragile balance of power in the school and ripple far beyond its walls. What happened next would not only test Naomi's strength but also the resolve of everyone around her. And as the pieces began to fall into place, one question loomed over it all: when justice finally arrives, will it be enough to undo the damage done? The hallway outside the principal's office was a buzz of whispers and stolen glances. Students passing by slowed their steps, straining to catch any sign of what was happening inside. It was unusual for a student to be called in so publicly, let alone someone like Naomi, who wasn't known for causing trouble. The tension in the air seemed to hang like a storm cloud. Inside, Naomi sat stiffly in the chair across from Principal Addison's desk. Officer Grayson stood by the window, arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on her like a predator sizing up its prey. Addison shuffled some papers nervously, her hands shaking ever so slightly. The room felt smaller than it was, its walls pressing in on Naomi with every passing second. "This situation is bigger than you think," Grayson said finally, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was firm, calculated, like someone trying to maintain control. We've had complaints about your attitude and the way you present yourself. Naomi kept her gaze locked on Addison. Complaints from who? She asked, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath. No one's ever said anything to me. If there's a problem, why am I hearing about it now? Addison avoided her eyes, looking instead at the papers on her desk. It's not just about today, Naomi. This has been building for some time. That's not true, Naomi shot back, her voice rising slightly. I've done nothing but follow the rules. I show up, I do my work, and I stay out of trouble. So why am I here? Grayson pushed himself off the wall and took a step closer, the smirk returning to his face. Because rules aren't just about what you do. They're about how you carry yourself, how you represent this school. And frankly, you're not setting the kind of example we expect here. Naomi's fists clenched in her lap. What example are you talking about? My grades are good. I've never been in trouble. So what is it about me that's a problem? Is it because I don't look like everyone else here? Addison flinched at the accusation, her face reddening. Grayson, however, didn't miss a beat. Don't play the victim, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. This has nothing to do with race. It's about respect. Something you clearly haven't learned. Naomi's voice cracked with frustration. Respect? You don't even know me. You've been targeting me since the day you started here, and for what? Because I won't stay quiet when you treat me differently. Enough. Addison's voice rang out, startling both Naomi and Grayson. She rubbed her temples as if trying to dispel a headache. Naomi, this isn't helping your case. Officer Grayson is here to maintain order, and his concerns about your behavior. What behavior? Naomi interrupted, standing up abruptly. You still haven't told me what I've done wrong. Grayson took a step forward, his tone colder than ever. Sit down. Naomi didn't move. For a moment, it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Grayson's jaw tightened, and his hand hovered near his belt where a pair of scissors gleamed ominously. This isn't a debate, he said, his voice low but threatening. Sit down. Naomi's chest heaved as she fought to keep her composure. Slowly, she lowered herself back into the chair, her eyes blazing with defiance. Addison cleared her throat, her voice shaky. I think we can resolve this without making it more dramatic than it needs to be. Grayson shot her a look, silencing whatever else she might have said. He turned back to Naomi, the scissors now in his hand. You think you're untouchable, don't you? That you can just do whatever you want and get away with it. Well, not today. Naomi's eyes widened as she realized what was about to happen. You can't, I can, he interrupted. And I will. Maybe this will teach you some humility. Addison opened her mouth to protest but closed it again, her fear of confrontation overriding whatever shred of guilt she might have felt. Naomi looked to her for help, but the principal simply looked away, her hands clutching the edge of the desk. The cold metal touched Naomi's scalp, and the sound of the first snip filled the room. It was a sound that Naomi would never forget, a sharp, cutting noise that echoed louder than anything else in her life up to that point. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears as strands of her hair fell onto her lap and the floor around her. Stop it, she finally screamed, jerking her head away. This is wrong. You can't do this to me. Grayson grabbed her shoulder, forcing her to stay still. You're going to learn respect, one way or another. The door to the office creaked open slightly, and for a split second, Naomi thought someone was coming to help. But it was just a gust of wind from the hallway. She was alone. Completely and utterly alone. When it was over, Naomi sat in stunned silence, her shaved head exposed, her dignity scattered like the hair on the floor. Grayson stepped back, looking smug. There, he said, tossing the scissors onto the desk. Now you'll think twice before stepping out of line. Naomi looked down at her hands, trembling with a mix of rage and humiliation. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to make him understand the depth of what he had just done. But all she could do was sit there, frozen, as Addison muttered something about filing a report. Grayson moved toward the door, but before he could leave, a voice boomed from the hallway. "What the hell is going on here?" Everyone in the room froze. The voice was deep, authoritative, and laced with an unmistakable fury. Naomi's head snapped up, her eyes wide with recognition. Grayson turned, his smirk faltering for the first time. "Who are you?" The man stepped into the office, his presence filling the space like a thunderstorm. His sharp suit and steely gaze left no doubt that he was not someone to be trifled with. "I'm her father," Marcus Carter said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you're about to explain why my daughter looks like this." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "Don't even try," he said, his voice shaking with restrained anger. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Naomi looked at her father, her tears finally spilling over. For the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope. But even as relief washed over her, she knew this was far from over. The storm had only just begun, and its full force was still to come. What would happen next? How far would Marcus go to ensure justice for his daughter? And would it be enough to undo the damage Grayson had caused? The answers were just around the corner, and they would shake everyone to their core. The silence in the principal's office was electric, broken only by the sound of Marcus Carter's footsteps as he crossed the room. Each step was deliberate, heavy, a reminder that every second of inaction on the part of Principal Addison and Officer Grayson was being scrutinized. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the scene, his daughter sitting in the chair, her head freshly shaven, strands of her hair scattered on the floor. Her hands trembled in her lap, though she quickly tried to hide it when she saw him. Marcus's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face barely containing the storm within him. He crouched in front of Naomi, his voice low but steady. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his eyes locking onto hers. Naomi blinked back tears, nodding, though her expression told a different story. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice cracking. Marcus reached out, his hand hovering near her face but not touching her, as if afraid his anger might somehow transfer to her. "We'll deal with this," he said firmly. "I promise." He straightened, turning his attention to the others in the room. Principal Addison was pale, her hands clutching the desk as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Grayson, on the other hand, stood with his arms crossed, his smirk long gone but his arrogance still present in the way he held himself. "What's your explanation?" Marcus asked, his voice like a blade slicing through the tension. His question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but his eyes lingered on Grayson. Grayson shifted his weight, trying to appear unaffected. "I was doing my job. Your daughter has been a disruption. Marcus cut him off, his voice rising slightly. "Is that what you call this? Humiliating a child in front of her peers? Shaving her head without her consent? That's your idea of discipline?" Grayson's face flushed, but he didn't back down. She needed to learn respect. Her attitude. Marcus's laugh was bitter, sharp. "You're telling me that a trained officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, felt so threatened by a teenage girl's attitude that he resorted to this? Spare me." Addison cleared her throat, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "Mr. Carter, I think we need to discuss this calmly." Marcus's gaze snapped to her, his voice icy. "You sat here and let this happen. You're as complicit as he is." Addison flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she fumbled with a pen on her desk, avoiding eye contact. I didn't know it would escalate like this." "Escalate?" Marcus repeated, his anger building. "You didn't know? Or you didn't care enough to stop it? Which is it?" Grayson stepped forward, his tone defensive. "Look, I followed protocol. If you have an issue with that, take it up with the school board. Oh, I will, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. But before I do, you're going to explain to me, right here, right now, what gave you the right to touch my daughter. Grayson hesitated, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. I don't have to explain myself to you. You don't. Marcus stepped closer, his towering presence forcing Grayson to take a step back. Because from where I'm standing, you have a lot to explain. And you'd better start now. The tension was suffocating, the air thick with the unspoken consequences of every word exchanged. Naomi watched silently, her eyes darting between her father and Grayson. She'd never seen Marcus like this, so controlled, yet so undeniably furious. It was both terrifying and comforting. Grayson's bravado faltered, but he wasn't ready to back down entirely. Your daughter has been causing issues for months. I was addressing a pattern of behavior. Marcus raised an eyebrow. A pattern? Tell me, Officer Grayson, what exactly is this pattern? And while you're at it, explain how shaving her head addresses it. Grayson opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his silence speaking volumes. That's what I thought, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the room like steel. This wasn't about discipline. This was about power. You wanted to humiliate her because you could. Because you thought no one would hold you accountable. Addison finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter, we can resolve this. Perhaps if we file a formal complaint. No, Marcus interrupted. A formal complaint isn't enough. My daughter deserves more than a piece of paper in a file. She deserves justice. He turned to Naomi, his expression softening for a moment. Do you want to go home? Naomi shook her head. No. I want to stay. Marcus nodded, his pride in her quiet resilience shining through. He faced Grayson and Addison again, his tone resolute. Here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to apologize to my daughter, right here, in front of everyone. Then, you're going to step down from your position, Officer Grayson. And if you think for 1 second that I'm bluffing, you're welcome to test me. Grayson's jaw tightened. You can't force me to do anything. Marcus smirked, though there was no humor in it. I'm a civil rights attorney. You think I can't? By the time I'm done, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose your badge, your reputation, and any shred of credibility you have left. So go ahead, refuse. I dare you. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on everyone. Grayson looked to Addison for support, but she was already shaking her head. I think you should listen to him, Addison said quietly. This has gone too far. Grayson stared at her, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. But he knew he was cornered. With a reluctant sigh, he turned to Naomi, his voice clipped and insincere. I'm sorry. Naomi's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but firm. You're not sorry. You're just scared. Grayson didn't respond, his expression darkening. Marcus stepped between them, his voice final. Get out. Grayson hesitated but eventually turned and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving behind a silence that felt almost deafening. Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he'd entered. He looked at Addison. This isn't over. I'll be in touch. Addison nodded, her face pale. I understand. Marcus turned to Naomi, extending a hand. Let's go. Naomi hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. As they walked out of the office, the eyes of students and teachers followed them, their silence a mix of shock, awe, and respect. The hallways seemed quieter than before, the tension from earlier replaced by an unspoken understanding. Marcus didn't say anything as they walked to the car, his grip on Naomi's hand firm but gentle. It wasn't until they were seated inside that he finally spoke. You're stronger than you know, he said softly. And I'm so proud of you. Naomi looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. I don't feel strong. Marcus smiled, his expression warm and reassuring. You are. And this, what happened today, it doesn't define you. It defines him. Naomi nodded, her resolve slowly returning. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in hours, she felt like she could face it. And Marcus, true to his word, was already planning his next move. This wasn't just about Naomi anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure what she had. And he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The ride home was heavy with unspoken emotions. Naomi stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Brighton Heights blur into a kaleidoscope of colors as her father drove in tense silence. The air between them was thick, not with anger, but with something deeper, unanswered questions, unresolved feelings, and the raw, simmering pain of what had just happened. Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice measured but heavy with emotion. Naomi, he began, glancing at her through the rearview mirror, I need you to tell me everything. Don't leave anything out. Naomi hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. You already saw what happened, she said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Marcus shook his head. I saw the aftermath. I need to understand what led up to it. I need to know how far this man has gone before today. Naomi drew in a shaky breath, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It's not just today, Dad. It's been happening for months. Grayson, he's always had it out for me. He stops me in the hall for no reason, asks me where I'm going like I'm sneaking around. Last month, he said my hair was distracting. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. I ignored it because I thought it would blow over. I thought if I kept my head down, he'd get bored and leave me alone. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, the knuckles turning white. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to bother you, Naomi admitted, her eyes dropping to her lap. You're always so busy with work, fighting for other people. I thought I could handle it. Marcus pulled over abruptly, turning to face her fully. Naomi, listen to me, he said, his voice low but intense. You are never a bother to me. Never. Do you understand that? Naomi nodded, tears streaming down her face. I just didn't think it would go this far, she whispered. I didn't think he'd do this. Marcus reached over, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You should never have had to think about how far someone like him would go. That's not on you. It's on him. They sat there for a moment, the car engine idling as the weight of their words hung in the air. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his tone firm. This is bigger than Grayson now. What he did to you wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. And I'm going to make sure he pays for it. Naomi's eyes met his, a spark of hope flickering amidst the pain. How? Marcus smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. That's what I do, remember. I fight for people who've been wronged. And this time, I'm fighting for you. The next morning, Marcus was already on the phone before the sun rose. His contacts list was long, and his reputation as one of the most tenacious civil rights attorneys in the state preceded him. By the time Naomi woke up, groggy and still emotionally drained, her father had already secured meetings with several key players. Naomi, he said as she entered the kitchen, we're going to the station first. I've filed a formal complaint against Grayson, and they're expecting us. Naomi hesitated, her stomach knotting. Do I have to go? I don't want to see him again. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You won't have to speak to him. But your statement is critical. They need to hear it from you. She nodded reluctantly, the thought of facing the institution that had employed someone like Grayson filling her with dread. Still, she trusted her father. If anyone could ensure she was heard, it was him. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers moved with purpose, some casting curious glances as Marcus and Naomi entered. They were directed to a small conference room where an internal affairs officer greeted them. "Mr. Carter," the officer began, extending a hand. "I've reviewed the preliminary report. Let me assure you, this matter is being taken seriously." "Good," Marcus replied, his tone clipped. "Because what happened to my daughter is not just a violation of protocol, it's a violation of her rights." Naomi sat quietly as her father and the officer discussed the logistics of the investigation. When it was her turn to speak, she recounted the events with precision, her voice trembling but steady. Every word felt like a weight being lifted, yet the burden of reliving the humiliation lingered. When they finished, the officer nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Naomi. Your courage in coming forward is commendable. Rest assured, we'll investigate thoroughly." As they left the station, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. "It's a reporter," he said, answering the call. The conversation was brief, but by the time Marcus hung up, his resolve had deepened. "The media is already picking up on this," he told Naomi. "That's good. People need to know what happened." The following days were a whirlwind. News outlets covered the story extensively, with headlines like "Officer Accused of Humiliating High School Student Sparks Outrage" dominating the airwaves. Social media exploded with posts and hashtags demanding justice for Naomi. The pressure mounted on the school board and the police department to take swift action. Naomi watched the coverage from the safety of her living room, a mix of emotions swirling within her. The support was overwhelming, but so was the attention. Strangers debated her experience as if it were a hypothetical case study, while others praised her bravery. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked one evening, sitting beside her on the couch. "I don't know," Naomi admitted. "It's just, a lot. I didn't ask for any of this." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You didn't. But sometimes, the fight finds us. And when it does, we have to decide how we're going to face it." Naomi leaned against him, drawing comfort from his presence. "I'm glad I'm not facing it alone." "You never will," Marcus promised. A week later, a hearing was held at the school board. The room was packed, parents, students, community members, and reporters filled every available seat. Grayson sat at one end of the table, his lawyer by his side, his expression one of forced composure. Naomi and Marcus sat at the opposite end, flanked by their own legal team. The hearing was tense, every word carrying weight. Testimonies were given, evidence presented. The video recorded by a student on the day of the incident played on a large screen, the room falling into a stunned silence as Grayson's actions were laid bare. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood with the poise of someone who had spent his entire career preparing for this moment. "What happened to my daughter was not just a personal attack, it was an attack on the values we claim to uphold as a community. We entrust our schools and our officers with the responsibility to protect, to nurture, to serve. What Officer Grayson did was the opposite of that. And if we allow this behavior to go unchecked, we're sending a message that justice only applies to some of us." The room erupted into applause as Marcus sat down. Even Naomi couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at her father's words. By the end of the hearing, the board voted unanimously to terminate Grayson's contract and refer the case to the district attorney for further action. Naomi exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief washing over her. As they left the building, a crowd of supporters cheered for Naomi and her father. Marcus placed a hand on her back, guiding her through the throng of cameras and microphones. "It's not over yet," he said quietly. "But we're one step closer." Naomi looked up at him, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Thank you, Dad. For everything." Marcus smiled back, his voice firm but warm. "This is what family does. We fight for each other." The days following the school board's decision were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. The official termination of Officer Grayson's employment felt like a victory, but it also left lingering questions. What would happen next? Would the legal case Marcus had set in motion hold up under scrutiny? And how would Naomi rebuild her confidence after such a public ordeal? Naomi sat in her room, scrolling through her phone. Social media was flooded with posts about her story. The hashtag Justice for Naomi trended for days, and while the overwhelming support was comforting, the constant attention felt suffocating. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, some praising her courage, others questioning the necessity of such a public outcry. People are so quick to judge, Naomi muttered under her breath. She locked her phone and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The quiet of her room was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Her mind replayed the events of the hearing, her father's powerful words, and the look on Grayson's face when the decision was announced. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, it was exhaustion. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Marcus entered, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Thought you could use this," he said, placing one on her desk. Naomi offered a weak smile. "Thanks, Dad." Marcus pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," she admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "It feels like everything is moving so fast. One minute I'm just trying to survive high school, and the next, I'm this. This?" Marcus tilted his head. Naomi gestured vaguely. "This person everyone's talking about. This, symbol of something bigger. It's overwhelming." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "It is bigger, Naomi. What happened to you is part of a much larger problem. But you don't have to carry the weight of that alone." "I know," she said softly. "But it still feels like too much." Marcus leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "You didn't choose this fight, Naomi, but you're handling it with more strength than most people twice your age. And you're not alone in this. I'm here. Your friends are here. Even strangers who've never met you are standing behind you." Naomi looked down at her tea, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it doesn't change anything? What if people just forget about it in a week?" Marcus reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But every step, every voice, every story matters. And your story has already made an impact. Look at how many people are talking about it. That's a start." Naomi nodded, the weight in her chest easing slightly. "I just don't want this to define me." "It won't," Marcus said with certainty. "It's a part of your story, but it's not the whole story. You get to decide who you are and what you do with this experience." The conversation stayed with Naomi long after Marcus left the room. She stared out the window, watching the neighborhood come alive as the evening settled in. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of clarity. Her father was right. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could control how she moved forward. Meanwhile, Grayson's world was unraveling. The news of his dismissal spread quickly, and with it came a flood of public backlash. His name and face were plastered across news outlets and social media, his actions condemned by nearly everyone who saw the footage. In his small apartment on the other side of town, Grayson sat in the dim light of his living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. The walls seemed to close in on him as he stared blankly at the television, which played a news segment about the case. Former school resource officer Daniel Grayson faces public outrage following allegations of abuse of power, the anchor reported. Legal experts suggest that civil and criminal charges may follow. Grayson's grip tightened around the glass in his hand. He turned off the TV with a sharp click and leaned back, the silence of the room pressing against him. For years, he'd prided himself on being a disciplinarian, someone who maintained order and commanded respect. But now, the very traits he once considered strengths had become his undoing. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he hesitated before picking it up. It was his lawyer, a man he'd hired in a panic after the school board hearing. "Grayson," the lawyer's voice crackled through the speaker, "I've gone through the preliminary case files. It doesn't look good." Grayson rubbed his temple, his frustration mounting. "I didn't break the law. I was enforcing discipline. You humiliated a minor, the lawyer shot back. On camera. In front of witnesses. That's not discipline, that's abuse. And the Carters aren't backing down. Marcus Carter is a heavyweight, and he's already filed civil charges. You need to prepare for the possibility of criminal charges as well. Grayson slammed the glass down, spilling whiskey onto the table. This is ridiculous. They're blowing it out of proportion. It doesn't matter what you think, the lawyer said bluntly. What matters is how this plays in court. And right now, you don't have much of a defense. Grayson hung up without another word, his anger boiling over. He stood and paced the room, his mind racing. For the first time, he felt the weight of consequences he couldn't control. Back in the Carter household, Marcus was working late into the night. His office was cluttered with case files, notebooks, and legal briefs, all part of his effort to ensure Grayson faced the full extent of the law. Naomi peeked in, her curiosity outweighing her fatigue. "Still at it?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus looked up, his expression softening. "This is important, Naomi. Every detail matters." She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the papers spread across his desk. "Do you think he'll go to jail?" "It's possible," Marcus said. "But even if he doesn't, this will follow him for the rest of his life. He won't be able to work in law enforcement again. And the civil case will make sure he's held accountable in other ways." Naomi nodded, a mix of satisfaction and unease settling over her. "It's just weird. Knowing someone's life is falling apart because of what they did to me." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Justice isn't about revenge, Naomi. It's about accountability. Grayson made choices, and now he has to face the consequences. That's not on you, it's on him." Naomi sat down across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of a notebook on the desk. "Do you think he feels bad about what he did?" Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "I don't know. But whether he does or doesn't, it doesn't change what he did. And it doesn't change what we're going to do about it." The room fell into a comfortable silence as they sat together, the unspoken understanding between them stronger than words. For Marcus, this fight was far from over. But for Naomi, the first glimmers of closure were beginning to take root. The following morning, Naomi woke up to the sound of muted voices drifting up from the kitchen. She rubbed her eyes, the tension from the past weeks still heavy in her chest. The sunlight streaming through the blinds seemed indifferent to the emotional weight she carried. Slowly, she got up and made her way downstairs, her footsteps light against the hardwood floor. In the kitchen, Marcus was seated at the table, his laptop open, and papers spread out in front of him. Across from him sat Jasmine, Naomi's best friend, her bright energy a welcome presence despite the solemnity in the air. "I told you she wouldn't be sleeping much longer," Jasmine said with a grin, turning to face Naomi. "You've got people out here working overtime for you." Naomi managed a small smile as she slid into a chair beside her friend. "What's going on?" "Your dad is planning world domination," Jasmine quipped, motioning toward the piles of paperwork. "Or at least the kind that gets people like Grayson out of the picture for good." Marcus gave Jasmine a patient look before turning his attention to Naomi. "We've been working on the next steps. The civil suit is moving forward, and I've been in contact with the district attorney's office. They're reviewing the case for criminal charges." Naomi sighed, her gaze falling to the table. "It just feels like it's never going to end." "It will," Marcus said firmly. "But these things take time. The important part is that we're holding him accountable." Jasmine leaned forward, her voice softer now. "You know everyone at school is on your side, right? People who never spoke out before are starting to. Teachers, students, even parents. This isn't just about what happened to you, it's about changing the way things are." Naomi nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "It's just hard to feel like things are changing when it still hurts so much." Jasmine reached over, squeezing her hand. That's because you're still in the middle of it. But I promise, from the outside, it's clear how strong you've been. People see it, Naomi. They're inspired by it. Naomi gave her a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Jazz. I don't know what I'd do without you. Probably sit around being miserable, Jasmine said with a wink, lightening the mood just enough to make Naomi laugh. Marcus watched the interaction quietly, his heart swelling with pride for his daughter's resilience. But beneath his calm exterior, he was still grappling with his own frustrations. Despite the progress they'd made, the emotional toll on Naomi was undeniable, and he couldn't shake the anger he felt toward Grayson. Every step of the legal process felt too slow, too detached from the pain his daughter had endured. As if sensing his thoughts, Jasmine turned to him. Mr. Carter, you've got this, right? Like, you're going to make sure Grayson never does this to anyone else. Marcus looked at her, his expression resolute. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Later that afternoon, Naomi and Marcus were invited to a community town hall organized by parents and local activists in support of their case. The event was held in the gymnasium of a nearby community center, where rows of folding chairs were set up facing a small stage. Naomi hesitated as they entered, her nerves kicking in at the sight of so many people. Do we really have to do this? She whispered to her father. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Just being here sends a message. As they took their seats near the front, the buzz of conversation filled the room. Familiar faces from their neighborhood, teachers, and even a few classmates smiled and nodded at Naomi, their silent support both comforting and overwhelming. Jasmine waved from the back row, her presence a steady anchor in the sea of strangers. The event began with a speech from a local activist, a middle-aged woman named Ms. Harper, whose fiery words ignited the crowd. She spoke about systemic injustice, the importance of community action, and the need to hold people like Grayson accountable. Her passion was contagious, and Naomi found herself sitting up straighter, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood confidently, his presence commanding the room. What happened to my daughter was not an isolated incident, he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that's been allowed to persist because too often, people like Grayson face no consequences for their actions. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Marcus continued. But this time, things are different. This time, we're not backing down. And with all of you standing with us, I have no doubt we'll see justice served. Naomi's chest swelled with pride as the crowd erupted into applause. For the first time, she felt the weight of the community behind her, their voices amplifying her own in a way that made her feel less alone. After the speeches, attendees approached Naomi and Marcus, offering words of encouragement and support. One woman, a teacher from another school, pulled Naomi aside. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. My daughter goes to a different high school, but she's faced similar things. What you're doing, it gives me hope that she won't have to go through this anymore. Naomi blinked back tears, nodding. Thank you. That means a lot. By the time they left the event, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still daunting, but knowing she wasn't walking it alone made all the difference. Meanwhile, Grayson's situation continued to deteriorate. News of the community's support for Naomi had reached him, and the pressure was mounting. His lawyer had called earlier in the day with more bad news. The district attorney's office was likely to press charges. Do you understand what this means? His lawyer had asked, his tone sharp. You're looking at the possibility of jail time, Daniel. This isn't something we can just sweep under the rug. Grayson had paced his apartment, his mind racing. Jail time. The thought was unbearable. He'd spent years enforcing the law, and now he was on the brink of becoming just another statistic. His anger boiled over, directed at everyone but himself. They're making me the villain, he muttered under his breath, slamming his fist against the wall. This isn't fair. But deep down, a small voice nagged at him, a faint whisper of guilt that he couldn't completely silence. He pushed it away, refusing to acknowledge the part of him that knew he'd crossed a line. The Carter household, however, was finally beginning to feel a semblance of normalcy. Naomi spent her evenings catching up on schoolwork and texting with Jasmine, while Marcus worked tirelessly to prepare for the upcoming trial. The case had drawn national attention, and the pressure was immense, but Marcus thrived under it. Every argument, every piece of evidence he gathered brought them one step closer to justice. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Marcus turned to Naomi. "I've been thinking," he said. "When this is all over, we should take a trip. Somewhere far away from all of this." Naomi looked at him, surprised. "Really?" Marcus smiled. "Really. You've been through enough, and I think we both could use a fresh start. Somewhere quiet, peaceful. Maybe by the ocean." Naomi's face lit up for the first time in weeks. "I'd like that." "Good," Marcus said, his smile widening. "Because you deserve it." For the first time in what felt like forever, Naomi felt a sense of hope, not just for the future, but for the possibility of healing. The journey wasn't over, but for now, she was content to take it one step at a time, knowing her father, and an entire community, had her back. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Naomi sat beside her father at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The civil trial against Grayson had captured national attention, and the room buzzed with the presence of journalists, activists, and community members who had come to support her. Grayson sat across the room, his face pale but his jaw clenched in defiance. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something to him, but he barely acknowledged it. The weight of the accusations and the public scrutiny had clearly taken their toll. For the first time, the man who had once wielded authority so easily looked small and powerless. As the judge entered and the room fell silent, Naomi felt her father's reassuring hand on her shoulder. Marcus's presence grounded her, his calm confidence reminding her that she wasn't alone. He had fought tirelessly to bring them to this moment, and now it was time for justice to be served. The proceedings were methodical, each side presenting their arguments with precision. Marcus's closing statement, however, was the moment that would stick in everyone's minds. He stood before the jury, his voice steady and commanding. "This case is not just about what happened to my daughter," he began, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's about the kind of society we want to build. A society where people in positions of power are held accountable for their actions. A society where no child has to experience the humiliation and pain that Naomi endured." He paused, letting his words sink in. Officer Grayson used his authority to intimidate, to harm, and to strip a young girl of her dignity. That is not discipline. That is not justice. And that is not acceptable. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was clear. Grayson was found guilty of abuse of power and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The court awarded Naomi significant damages, a financial acknowledgement of the pain and suffering she had endured. Naomi exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears streaming down her face. Marcus pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering, "We did it." The judge's ruling didn't just mark a legal victory, it sent a powerful message. Grayson's actions had consequences, and his name would forever be associated with his misconduct. His career in law enforcement was over, and the case became a landmark example of accountability. But the resolution didn't end there. In the weeks following the trial, Naomi began to rebuild her life. The school implemented new policies to address systemic biases, including mandatory training for staff and stricter oversight of disciplinary actions. Principal Addison resigned quietly, her inaction during the incident drawing criticism from the community. Naomi, once hesitant about her newfound role as a symbol of change, embraced it gradually. She started speaking at local events, sharing her story to inspire others to stand up against injustice. Her voice, once silenced in the principal's office, now carried weight and purpose. One evening, after a particularly emotional panel discussion, Naomi and Marcus sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Naomi turned to her father, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Marcus smiled, his gaze soft. "Not over, Naomi. Just the beginning. Change doesn't happen in one big moment, it happens in the small ones that follow. You've already started something bigger than you realize." Naomi nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It already has," Marcus said. "And it will keep making a difference. Because of you." As for Grayson, his life was irrevocably changed. Stripped of his badge and reputation, he retreated from public life. The legal fallout left him financially and emotionally drained, and his attempts to find work outside of law enforcement were met with closed doors. For the first time, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions, not as a man in power, but as a man without it. In his quiet moments, Grayson found himself haunted by Naomi's face, the strength in her voice as she testified against him. He began to realize that the authority he had wielded so recklessly had not made him strong, it had made him blind. Whether he would ever truly change remained uncertain, but the consequences of his choices would follow him for the rest of his life. Naomi's life continued to evolve. The damages awarded from the trial allowed her to invest in her future, funding her college education and her dreams of becoming a marine biologist. But it wasn't the money that mattered most, it was the sense of closure and the knowledge that her fight had made a difference. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Naomi and Marcus attended a community event celebrating the progress that had been made. The gymnasium was filled with faces she recognized and others she didn't, all there to honor her courage and the change it had sparked. As Naomi took the stage to speak, her voice no longer wavered. She shared her story not with bitterness, but with hope, urging others to stand together against injustice. The applause that followed was deafening, a testament to the power of her journey. Afterward, Marcus joined her on stage, his arm around her shoulders. "You've come a long way," he said, pride evident in his voice. "So have we," Naomi replied, smiling up at him. "Together." Reflecting on Naomi's story, it's clear that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about creating a better path forward. It's about courage, resilience, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Naomi's journey reminds us that real change starts with one voice, one story, and the unwavering belief that things can get better. What about you? Have you ever faced a situation where standing up for yourself or others felt like an impossible choice? How did it shape you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, your voice matters. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. If Naomi's story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of resilience. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the power of change.